Now let's take a look at how World War I was fought both at sea and, for the first time, in the air. Starting with war at the sea. If you look at page 53, you'll see the beginning of the discussion of this topic. It's important to assess the reasons for war at sea and the importance of it to both sides. Obviously, both sides would need to be able to transport men and supplies to the battlefields. The Allies particularly needed to do so because Great Britain, as we know, is an island. It needed to be able to transport men and supplies to the battlefields across Europe, down into the Middle East, and even into the colonial regions in Africa and Asia. They also needed food and other industrial supplies from its allies such as the United States. Therefore, the protection of its ships was vital. Germany did not need the sea for the same reasons, except for the fact that they needed to be able to get supplies and food from overseas. They did not need the naval routes to support their allies, because, as we know, their allies were already located within Europe. Whoever could control the seas would have a clear advantage over the opposing side and be able to achieve a victory much quicker. However, this battle for the sea was to drag out and remained deadlocked for quite some time. From an earlier recording, we learned about the naval race that was initiated by Germany's expansion and rise of power, which scared the British and allowed them the determination that they needed to develop the new dreadnought. As Britain continued to develop these ships, other countries were trying to catch up as well. The Germans and other allies were able to make similar copies of the dreadnought. However, the British were able to eventually regain their numerical advantage. At that point, the Germans decided to focus on a new weapon at sea, the submarine, or what the Germans called Unterseeboot, U-boat for short. With this introduction of the U-boat into World War I, the tactics used at sea changed on both sides. The British and her allies focused on blockading key ports of the Germans and using the ships to transport supplies, food, and armies to key locations. The Germans, on the other hand, attempted to stop these objectives of the Allies using their submarines. The Allied-led blockades of Germany proved to be particularly devastating for the people because it resulted in mass starvation across the country of Germany. The Central Powers were also able to initiate some of their own blockades, as we know from the previous recording about how they were able to blockade the Black Sea ports of Russia through the cutting off of the Dardanelles Straits. Therefore, the Russian people also suffered similar consequences when it came to starvation. Along with blockading, British naval vessels also enforced the right of search on neutral shipping to try to make sure that Germany and her allies were not getting supplies from other countries. The British have been known for this throughout the past. If you're familiar with early American history, this was a key issue that led to the War of 1812. The British naval ships often stopped American cargo ships on their way to Europe and conducted searches and seizures and also the impressment of troops onto their own ships. So the usage of naval vessels was a huge part of World War I, but the submarine particularly terrified the Allies at first until they figured out effective strategies to combat it. Submarines and the use of sea mines completely changed the conduct of naval warfare. Previous to the introduction of submarines, ships carried out battles at close range right against from each other. But now with hidden submarines, it caused serious losses to huge Allied ships and cargoes because they were basically rendered defenseless because they could not spot the submarines at first. The Allies were greatly devastated by German submarine warfare in the beginning of World War I. Additionally, for the Germans, it was politically dangerous, risky, to attack cargo ships and merchant ships coming across the waters. If ships were targeted that carried civilians, there could be a huge outrage, which we saw with the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania was a British liner carrying about 1,000 passengers, and 128 of those were Americans. The Germans believed that there were arms and munitions in the cargo holds of the Lusitania. However, it was a passenger ship. When the Germans sunk the ship with their U-boat, they claimed that they were justified because they believed the ship to have been carrying war supplies, which made it a legitimate target. However, there was huge outcry on the part of the Allied countries and the United States, which had not entered the war at that point. It was something that pushed us much closer to war. After the Lusitania sinking, the Germans scaled down their U-boat campaign and even made promises to not target civilian ships, which they later broke, because at first, after the Lusitania sinking, the Germans were concerned about the entry of the Americans. Later on, they believed the Americans to be indirectly involved anyways, so they didn't mind the unrestricted sub-warfare. But they did try to scale back their submarine warfare immediately after the sinking of the Lusitania. Nevertheless, if you look at page 54, right above the map, you can see the damage that the German U-boats inflicted. Britain lost 464,000 tons of shipping, and in April of 1917, it lost 834,000 tons. So the Germans were almost near successful in initiating a blockade that would starve Britain and France into surrender before the USA could declare war. So basically, to boil it down, the German U-boat objectives would be to stop, as much as possible, any Allied ship from making any delivery of supplies, food, or men anywhere across Europe, as much as they could. The main reason that the British were able to survive this onslaught of the U-boats was the development of a new strategy called the Convoy System. Let's take a look at what was behind the idea of this. If you look at the bottom of page 54, you can see that people realized that ships that had been sunk by U-boats were usually traveling alone, and they were unarmed merchant ships that did not have any type of protection. So therefore, the guy who was in charge of Great Britain at the time, Lloyd George, came up with this idea of a convoy system in which large numbers of merchant ships would sail together with a naval escort, thereby offering them at least some level of protection. It took some time for there to be complete acceptance of this idea, but eventually the people of Britain agreed, and once they put this strategy into practice, you can see at the top of page 55 that it was a turning point in the sea warfare of World War I. By October of 1917, a total of 99 homeward-bound convoys had reached harbor safely, and only 10 vessels had been lost. The last quarter of 1917 saw 235 ships lost compared to 413 ships in the second quarter of the year. That shows you that the convoy system was successful in reducing the number of shipping losses. But you can also see with the bullets on page 55 that there were other factors that came into play to help eliminate the threat of German U-boats. These factors included the role of the U.S. in producing a great deal of supplies that the Germans simply could not keep up with the amount of ships coming across. Also, the development of new technologies such as early forms of sonar, which allowed vessels to be able to locate German submarines with much greater accuracy. Sonar would be a huge part of World War II. In the end, Britain was able to enjoy its naval supremacy that it had had for quite some time, and this is what was a central part of the Allied victory in all of World War I. If you look at the bottom of page 55, the British Navy was able to move 8.5 million troops across the British Empire, which included places in Europe, Africa, Asia, and they were able to continue to allow shipping to come into these ports that included more men, food, supplies, which allowed them to maintain a devastating blockade on Germany, and then later on in the war to transport Americans to different parts of Europe for the final battles. But you can also see, to kind of highlight the reasons why the Germans focused more on submarines, the Battle of Jutland in 1916, in which the Germans tried to lure out part of the British fleet, but got more than they had anticipated. Even though the Germans lost fewer ships in the battle, Britain was left in control of surface waters. So that again shows you why the Germans focused more on submarine warfare. Finally, let's consider the war in the air, as it was a huge feature of World War I as far as how important people realized it could be in warfare. In the early stages of the war, the main type of air warfare was conducted by airships. Airships are not the same thing as airplanes. We would probably consider them closer to the Goodyear blimp than anything else. The Germans developed an airship of their own, which was more deadly than the British one, and the German was called a Zeppelin. The British used their airships mainly for escorting ships and spotting U-boats because they could communicate with surface ships through the use of radio. However, the German Zeppelin was able to carry out bombing on civilian and industrial targets in Great Britain. You can see on page 56 that the Germans had a force of 30 Zeppelins. Now, these were filled with hydrogen, which made them highly flammable, but because of the height that they flew at, the Germans considered them to be relatively safe. When British defenses improved, the Germans had to redesign their airship, and they eventually decided to scrap the idea of using an airship and instead focused on the development of bomber aircraft. The most famous of theirs was called the Gotha, and it was able to inflict 3,000 casualties in raids against London and other parts of southeast England. In the last year of the war, the British were able to respond with their own bombing raids into enemy territory. By February of 1918, there were, quote, round-the-clock raids, and the idea of attacking civilians from the air was now a huge feature of warfare in the 20th century. If you look on the screen here, you can see the rapid development of warfare from the air, how it started off with simple airships and zeppelins. You might have heard of a very famous zeppelin that the Germans had called the Hindenburg, which did explode from its highly flammable hydrogen. And then you could see the replacement by bomber aircrafts, the targeting of civilians, the use of aircraft for reconnaissance. They could see the trenches from above, see where their artillery targets were placed. With the development of better radio, aerial communication became more of a possibility between aircraft and ground forces. Finally, the last feature of air warfare to evolve in World War I was the idea of dogfights, aircraft versus aircraft in the air fighting through the use of machine guns which were mounted on board the planes. Dogfights became a common sight over the trenches, and these machine guns that were mounted on board the airplanes were able to hit the other plane without striking the propeller blades, making them very effective for shooting down the enemy aircraft. The overall importance of air warfare is really well described at the bottom paragraph on page 57 and the sidebar on page 57 as well. Basically, the idea that they could be used to bomb civilians, they were really good propaganda, and their effectiveness in clearing out the enemy trenches and other key targets made them a very important feature of warfare, both in World War I and in the wars to come.